The prisoner was walking again. Warden Thal pressed 3 of his 4 hands flat against the observation console and watched the corridor feed. Cell block Orek, sublevel 9, deep inside the Conclave's highest security detention barge Vorenthas. The human female moved at a steady pace through the passage she should not have been able to reach. Her gait was even, unhurried. Her bare feet left thermal prints on the polished deck that the sensors flagged in yellow elevated body temperature, consistent with sustained physical exertion. She was bleeding from a wound above her left eye. The blood ran in a thin line down the side of her face and dripped from her jaw. She did not wipe it. She did not appear to notice it. "How long since containment failure?" Thal asked. Senior Watch Officer Preeny checked her terminal. Her neck frills were pressed flat against her skull, a stress response she had not managed to suppress. 41 minutes, Warden. 41 minutes. Thal had been on shift for 6 hours. The transfer convoy from the forward detention platform at Rithik Station had docked 90 minutes ago. 16 prisoners from 7 species, all high value, all bound for long-term processing aboard the Vorenthas. Standard intake. Standard restraint protocols. He had overseen hundreds of transfers in his career. Thousands, if he counted the years at the border facilities. The human had been the last one off the transport. He had read the transfer file before docking. Species, Terran, designation, inmate 3308, name on record, Marin Sorrel. Captured during the pacification of a colonial mining outpost in the Vainkaris Reach, 4 standard months ago. The capture report was 9 pages long, 3 times the standard length. The transfer advisory from Rithik Station was longer. Attached to it was a behavioral log that ran to 47 entries in a file that should have contained, at most, 5. Thal had skimmed it. He should have read every word. The advisory's summary line, which he had read, stated, "Terran specimen displays atypical persistence under physical duress. Recommend enhanced restraint and continuous sedation during transfer. Do not reduce chemical suppression below Category 5 threshold." Thal had followed the recommendation. Category 5 sedation, the level reserved for species whose neurochemistry could override standard tranquilization. He had used it on Valthek berserkers once. A Valthek berserker under Category 5 sedation became limp within seconds, unconscious for hours. The dosage was calibrated to suppress conscious function across every known neural architecture in the Conclave's biological database. It was not a mild precaution. It was the chemical equivalent of turning off a brain. The human had been awake when they unloaded her. Not groggy, not disoriented, awake. She had walked off the transport under her own power, flanked by 2 armored escorts, her wrists locked in magnetic shackles, her ankles chained with a half-meter tether. Her eyes had moved across the docking bay with slow, measuring attention, the kind of attention that cataloged exits, counted personnel, noted distances. Thal had seen that look before, in career predators who never stopped calculating even when the cage door was shut. But in those species, the look was always accompanied by something else, tension or aggression, or the coiled readiness of a body preparing to strike. The human's body was not preparing to strike. Her shoulders were relaxed, her hands hung loose in the shackles, her breathing was steady. She moved through the docking bay the way a professional assessor moves through a property, noting everything, reacting to nothing, filing information for later use. There was no urgency in her, and that was the first thing that unsettled Thal, though he did not recognize the feeling at the time. He had ordered the dosage doubled. The medical officer on intake duty, a Conclave-certified xenobiologist named Dren Ossel, had looked at Thal with an expression that sat somewhere between professional concern and something less clinical. "Warden, Category 5 at double concentration is. I have never administered that dosage to a Terran. The metabolic literature suggests their hepatic system may process the compound faster than." "Administer it," Thal had said. Ossel had administered it. He had pressed the injector against the muscle of the human's upper arm. She had not flinched, had not even looked at the device, and delivered the full double dose. The compound entered her bloodstream, and every monitoring screen in the intake bay registered the effect. The human's vital signs dipped for 11 seconds, heart rate from 72 to 61, respiratory rate from 14 to 12, her pupils dilated fractionally. A fine tremor passed through her hands, visible in the shackles. Then both numbers climbed back to baseline and held steady, as if her body had tasted the sedation, decided what it was, and dismissed it. Ossel had cycled through 3 different scanner modes, checking and rechecking the readout. "That is not possible," he said quietly. "At this concentration, the compound saturates the neural receptor sites. The binding affinity is near total. There is nowhere for the signal to go except into suppression. Her brain should be offline. She should not be conscious." "But she is," Thal had said. "She is." Ossel paused. "Her liver is metabolizing the compound approximately 4 times faster than our models predict. She is not resisting the drug. She is processing it, burning through it the way a furnace burns through fuel, and her body is already producing enzymes to accelerate the clearance rate. I could administer a 3rd dose, but I suspect the result would be the same. Her system is not fighting the sedation. It is treating it as a problem to be solved, and it is solving it." The human had watched this exchange with an expression that Thal, replaying the memory now, could only describe as patient. Not smug, not defiant, just patient. The way someone waits through a process they have seen before and know the outcome of. They had put her in cell 7, sublevel 9, the deepest cell in the deepest block of the Vorenthas. Walls rated for plasma containment, the same material used in the linings of reactor vessels. Magnetic locks with triple redundant power feeds, each drawing from a separate generator. A gravity floor that could be increased to 6 standard units at the touch of a console. Environmental controls that could reduce the temperature to -40 or flood the space with inert gas. Biometric monitoring on continuous feed, with alerts set to trigger at the slightest deviation from baseline. Cell 7 was where the Conclave put the things it was genuinely afraid of. In 80 years of operation, nothing had escaped from Cell 7. They put Maren Sorrel in Cell 7 and sealed the door, and Thal told himself that it was enough. 38 minutes later, she broke out. He was still reconstructing how. The surveillance footage was being analyzed by a technical team on the deck above, but the preliminary report was already on his console, and it read like something written by someone who had stopped trusting their own instruments. The human had dislocated her right shoulder, deliberately. She had braced her body against the cell wall, positioned the joint at a specific angle against the ridge where the wall met the floor, and wrenched it out of its socket with a single controlled motion. The biometric monitors registered a massive pain spike nerve activity consistent with what the medical database classified as severe, incapacitating trauma. The kind of pain that should collapse conscious motor function in any known sapient species. The kind of pain that was, in every biological model the Conclave possessed, the body's absolute command to stop. Her heart rate had increased by 4 beats per minute. That was the only measurable response. No vocalization, no change in her breathing pattern, no facial contortion visible on the cell camera. She had dislocated her own shoulder, an injury that would leave a Valthex screaming and a Kresh catatonic, and her body's total acknowledgement of the event was 4 additional heartbeats per minute. With the dislocated shoulder, she had gained enough range of motion to reach the environmental sensor panel on the ceiling of the cell. From there, the technical team was still trying to understand the sequence. She had done something with the panel's wiring, something that rerouted the gravity floor's calibration signal through the magnetic lock's feedback loop. The lock had opened, not forced, not broken, opened as if she had entered the correct code. She had not entered any code. She had fed the lock a false signal through hardware that was never designed to communicate with it. The technical team's preliminary assessment was that the exploit required an understanding of the lock's electromagnetic architecture that should not have been available to someone who had been inside the cell for less than 40 minutes. Then she had walked out, with a dislocated shoulder and a sedative dose in her bloodstream that would have killed a Valthek. She had walked out of the most secure cell on the Vorenthas and started moving through the corridors of Sublevel 9. "Warden," Preenie's voice was carefully professional, the way it always was when she was suppressing something less professional underneath. "She has reached the junction at Oryx 7. Security Team Kesh is holding position at the far end." Thal watched the feed. Security Team Kesh 6 guards, full tactical armor, stun projectors, and concussive rifles. They were spread across the corridor in a containment arc, the standard formation for blocking a single hostile in a confined space. He could see the nearest guard's face through his visor. The guard was a veteran named Fen Korast, 12 years in the Conclave's detention service, 3 commendations. His weapon was steady. His eyes were not. The human kept walking, same pace, same unhurried gait. She was not running, she was not charging. She was walking towards 6 armed guards with a dislocated shoulder and blood running down her face, and her expression was the thing that made Thal's secondary stomach clench. She looked patient, not angry, not desperate, not afraid, patient. Like someone who had been through this before and knew how it ended, and was waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same understanding. "Stun projectors," Thal ordered. "Full dispersal, put her down." The command relayed instantly. On the feed, he watched Korast raise his weapon and fire. The stun projector discharged a neural disruption pulse calibrated to overload the target's motor cortex, a focused electromagnetic burst that scrambled voluntary muscle control. Effective range, 20 meters. Effective against every bipedal species in the Conclave's classification index. Thal had seen it drop a charging Threnix at full sprint. The Threnix had not moved again for 40 minutes. The pulse hit Marin Sorrel in the center of her chest. She stumbled, her left knee buckled. For 1 second, one full second that Thal counted with the rational, measuring part of his mind, she went down to one knee on the deck. Her hand slapped the floor. Her chin dipped toward her chest. The biometric feed registered the hit. Motor cortex disruption across 60% of voluntary muscle groups. Then she stood up. She stood up the way a structure reassembles itself after an impact, not recovering, not gathering strength, but simply returning to its default state. Her muscles contracted, her balance shifted, her legs straightened, and she was walking again. Same pace. On the feed, Korast looked at his weapon, looked back at the human. His mouth moved behind his visor. Thal could not hear the words, but the shape of them was clear. A question, not tactical. Personal, something along the lines of "What is she?" The guards fired again. 3 projectors this time, overlapping pulses. A saturation pattern designed to guarantee neural shutdown even in species with distributed nervous systems. The combined discharge would have dropped a Threnix war mount. The corridor lights flickered from the energy draw. The human went to both knees. Her hands hit the deck. Her head dropped. The biometric feed showed her heart rate at 140, her cortisol levels spiking into ranges the system flagged as critical. Her core temperature climbing past what the medical database listed as the upper boundary for Terran survival. She stayed down for 4 seconds. "She is down," Preenie said. Thal watched the feed. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. Marin Sorrel pushed herself off the deck. Her arms shook. A visible tremor ran through her shoulders and down her spine. Blood from the head wound had smeared across the floor where her face had pressed against it. She got one foot under her, then the other. The motion was not graceful. It was mechanical, deliberate, each muscle group firing in sequence as if she were operating her body from a manual. She stood. And she walked. That, Preeny stopped, started again. Warden, that is not a standard physiological response. Thal said nothing. He was watching the guards. Kores, the 12-year veteran, had lowered his weapon. Not a tactical decision, not a conscious choice. The weapon had simply drifted downward, as if the hands holding it had quietly disconnected from the part of the brain that gave orders. The guard was staring at the human through his visor, and Thal could read the exact thought on his face, because it was the same thought forming in his own mind. It was not admiration. It was not respect. It was the cold, crawling recognition that the tools in your hands do not work, and the thing coming toward you knows it. Concussive charges, Thal said. His voice was steady. It cost him something to keep it that way. Center mass, all 6 guards, simultaneous volley. Preeny turned to look at him. Warden, concussive charges are authorized for Category 8 threats. She is classified as. I am reclassifying her, now. Concussive charges, simultaneous volley, execute. The concussive charges were not stun weapons. They were anti-personnel munitions designed to incapacitate through sheer kinetic force. A focused shockwave that hit the target's body like a wall moving at 200 meters per second. They broke bones. They ruptured organs. They were the last tool before lethal force, and Thal was authorizing them against a single unarmed prisoner in a corridor, and he understood exactly what that said about the situation. The volley hit her like a freight conveyance. The sound reached Thal through the audio feed, a concussive thud that distorted the microphone and turned the corridor into a brief, violent blur of displaced air and debris. The emergency lighting surged and dimmed. When the feed cleared, Marin Sorrel was on the floor, on her back, 6 meters from where she had been standing, blown backward by the combined impact. The biometric feed showed her heart rate at 188, her blood oxygen dropping. 3 of her ribs fractured on the left side, according to the structural sensors embedded in the intake restraints still attached to her wrists. Internal bruising across her left kidney. Microhemorrhaging in her left lung. 3 broken ribs. A dislocated shoulder that she had never reset. A head wound still bleeding. A sedative load that should have her comatose. And the accumulated neural damage from 3 stun projector hits that should have reduced her motor cortex to a state of temporary paralysis. She did not get up immediately. Thal watched the feed. The guards held position, weapons aimed. The corridor was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and the faint, wet sound of the human breathing. Thal studied the breathing. It was not the shallow, irregular gasping of a body shutting down. It was deliberate. Controlled, deep inhalation through the nose, slow exhalation through the mouth. She was managing her respiration, manually overriding the panic signals her damaged body was broadcasting. She was choosing to breathe. Seal corridor Oryx 7, Thal ordered. Flood the section with inert somnolent gas, full saturation. The gas dispensers activated. A pale amber mist began to fill the corridor, settling toward the floor where the human lay. Somnolent gas, a neural depressant that worked through inhalation, bypassing the bloodstream and acting directly on the brainstem's arousal centers. It was used for mass pacification of riot populations. At full saturation, it could put an entire cell block to sleep in under a minute. The gas reached the human. Thal watched the biometric feed. Her respiratory rate slowed. Her eyelids flickered. For a moment, 8 seconds, maybe 9, her body responded the way the medical database predicted. The brainstem signals began to dampen. Her muscle tone decreased. She was going under. Then her breathing changed. She shifted it voluntarily. Instead of the slow, deep breaths that would draw the maximum amount of gas into her lungs, she switched to rapid, shallow inhalations, short pulls of air through her mouth, barely enough to sustain consciousness, but enough. Each breath took in a fraction of the gas that a normal respiration cycle would deliver. She was rationing her own air intake, manually controlling a process that should have been automatic, trading oxygen efficiency for reduced chemical exposure. And she was moving. Not standing, not yet, but moving. Her left hand groped along the floor until it found the base of the wall. She pulled herself toward it, dragged her body across the deck with her one functional arm, her broken ribs grinding against each other with every motion, her face pressed into the amber mist. She reached the wall and pressed her nose and mouth against the junction where the wall met the floor. She is seeking the boundary layer. Ossel's voice came through from the medical station, and now there was something in his tone that Thal had never heard from the xenobiologist before. It was awe stripped of any pleasure. The gas is heavier than the station's air mix. It settles. But at the wall junction, the air circulation creates a microcurrent of cleaner air. She found it. She is breathing from a pocket of air that is perhaps 2 centimeters wide. Thal stared at the feed. The human's face was pressed against the base of the wall, her lips drawing air from a gap that was barely visible. Her eyes were squeezed shut against the gas. Her body trembled with the effort of maintaining the position. 20 seconds passed. 30. The lead guard chorus spoke through the squad channel, his voice audible on the feed. She is not going under. The gas is at full saturation and she is not going under. Thal felt something shift in the operations center. A change in the quality of the silence, the way a room changes when every person in it arrives at the same realization simultaneously, and no one wants to be the first to name it. His junior watch officers were no longer monitoring their screens with professional attention. They were watching the corridor feed. All of them. The way people watch something they do not want to see but cannot look away from. Increase gas concentration to 140%, Thal said. Warden, 140% exceeds the safe exposure threshold for the guards in the. Pull the guards back, seal the corridor, 140%. The guards retreated. The pressure doors sealed. The gas concentration rose. The amber mist thickened until the corridor was opaque, the human visible only as a shape on the floor near the wall, her biometric data the only clear readout. Her heart rate was climbing again, 130, 140. Her blood oxygen was dropping, but slowly she was still breathing from the boundary layer, still rationing, still managing her intake with a precision that should have been impossible for a brain under that much chemical assault. At 160% concentration, 7 minutes in, her body began to fail. Not the sudden collapse Thal was hoping for, a slow, grinding deterioration. Her heart rate became irregular. Her blood oxygen dropped below the threshold for sustained consciousness. Her muscle activity decreased. She stopped moving. But she kept breathing. Those shallow, rationed breaths, still pulling from the boundary layer, still cycling air through a system that was shutting down around them. Her body was failing, and her lungs were still working, still pulling, still refusing to stop the one action that kept her alive. Warden, Ossel again, she is losing consciousness, but I want you to see something. A biometric overlay appeared on Thal's console. Watch her adrenal output. Thal watched. As consciousness faded, the human's adrenal glands increased their output, not the sharp spike of a fear response. A slow, sustained ramp. Her body was flooding itself with the chemical tools it needed to restart once the external threat was removed. She was losing consciousness, and her body was already preparing to wake up. She is setting an alarm, Ossel said. Her endocrine system is priming for a surge that will trigger the moment the gas concentration drops. She will wake up. Not slowly, not groggily. She will wake up ready to move. Thal looked at the feed. The human was still on the floor, still breathing, still going down, still, even in the process of losing consciousness, preparing for the next attempt. Vent the gas, Thal said quietly. Pull Team Kesh back to the next checkpoint. Get me a second tactical unit from the upper decks. Preetney relayed the orders without comment. She did not ask why he was venting the gas when it was working. She had been watching the same biometric data. She understood the calculation. The gas would keep the human down for as long as it was maintained, but maintaining it required sealing the corridor indefinitely, and the human's body was already adapting. If they kept her under for an hour, her liver would have metabolized enough of the compound that the boundary layer trick would no longer be necessary. If they kept her under for 2 hours, her system would have built enzymes to process the gas the way it had processed the sedation. Every tool they used, her biology filed away and began developing a countermeasure. They could not contain her with chemistry, they could only slow her down. The gas vented, fresh air cycled through the corridor. Thal watched the biometric feed and counted. Her adrenal surge hit at 14 seconds. Heart rate spiked from 60 to 110 in 3 beats. Cortisol flooded her system. Her eyes opened. 14 seconds. From unconscious to conscious in 14 seconds, with enough presence of mind to immediately assess her surroundings, head turning, eyes tracking the sealed pressure doors, the camera positions, the residual amber tint in the air. She sat up, slowly, carefully. Her broken ribs made the motion difficult, but she managed it with the methodical patience of someone who had moved through pain so many times that the process was routine. She braced her left hand against the wall. She pushed herself to her feet. And she walked. Thal turned to Preeny. Get me everything the Conclave has on Terran endurance physiology, the full xenobiological file, not the summary, not the behavioral brief, everything. Preeny accessed the database. The file was extensive. Thal had never read it because the behavioral briefs had always been sufficient for his purposes. He was a warden. He managed containment protocols. He did not need to understand the biology of his inmates. He needed to know what kept them in their cells. The file changed that calculation. He read while watching the corridor feed, where the guards had fallen back to the next junction and the human was still walking. She had been on her feet for over an hour now, counting the time before the gas. The wound above her eye had partially clotted. Her dislocated shoulder hung at an angle that looked wrong even on the low-resolution feed. She walked anyway. The xenobiological summary on Terran endurance was written in the neutral, clinical language of Conclave science, but the data underneath it was not neutral. It was, Thal realized as he read, a quiet catalog of impossibilities. Terrans, the file stated, were persistence predators. Their evolutionary heritage was not speed, not strength, not natural weaponry. It was duration. Their bodies were built to continue operating under conditions that would shut down the physiology of every other known sapient species. The specifics were what made Thal's hands go still on the console. Their cardiovascular system could maintain sustained output for hours, not minutes, hours. A Terran in moderate physical condition could maintain a pace of movement that was not fast, not by any predatory standard, but was continuous. They did not sprint and collapse. They did not burst and rest. They moved at a steady pace and they did not stop. The file cited field studies from the species' homeworld. Terrans had hunted prey animals not by chasing them down, but by following them, walking after them, for hours, for days. Until the prey animal, which was faster in every measurable way, simply stopped because its body could no longer thermoregulate, could no longer sustain flight, could no longer function. And the Terran was still walking. Their thermoregulatory system was the key. Where most species cooled through panting or periodic rest, Terrans sweated. Their entire skin surface was a radiator. They could shed metabolic heat continuously, without stopping, without resting, without slowing down. It meant they never overheated. It meant their muscles never seized from thermal buildup. It meant that while every other pursuit predator in the known galaxy eventually had to stop, a Terran did not. But that was only the physiological baseline. The file went further. Their pain response was not binary. Most sapient species experienced pain as an override signal, a neurological command that reduced motor function proportionally to injury severity. Broken bone, motor function reduced by 60 to 80%. Organ damage, motor function suppressed. Severe trauma, shutdown. It was a protective mechanism, universal across known biology. Pain told the body to stop, and the body obeyed. Terran pain did not work that way. Their pain was a signal, but it was not a command. Their conscious brain could receive the pain signal and choose whether to act on it, not through chemical suppression, not through mutation or defect. Through a cognitive process the file described as cortical pain modulation, the ability of the Terran prefrontal cortex to evaluate pain signals, assess their tactical relevance, and selectively reduce their influence on motor function. They could choose to keep moving with broken bones. They could choose to keep fighting with ruptured organs. They could choose to keep functioning through levels of damage that would leave any other sapient species immobile, because their brains treated pain not as an order but as information, data to be assessed, weighed, and if tactically necessary, overridden. And there was more. Their tissue repair was continuous, not fast, not by any acute standard. A Terran could not regenerate a limb or close a wound in seconds, but their bodies constantly produced repair cells, dispatched them to damaged sites, and began reconstruction even while the damage was ongoing. A Terran with a broken bone was already healing the bone while still using the limb. A Terran with lacerations was already closing the wounds while still bleeding. Their bodies did not wait for safety to begin recovery. They recovered in the field, under fire mid-stride. The implications of that last fact stopped Thal cold. Every containment strategy in the Conclave's doctrine assumed a simple equation: damage exceeds repair, and the subject is contained. Apply enough force, and the target's body degrades faster than it can recover. But Terrans recovered continuously. Not fast enough to outrun catastrophic damage, no, but fast enough to maintain function through levels of sustained attrition that would accumulate past any other species' failure point. They did not need to heal completely. They needed to heal enough to keep the muscles firing, enough to keep the joints moving, enough to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Always enough to walk. Thal set the file down. On the corridor feed, Marin Sorrel had reached the next junction. Security Team Kesh had fallen back again. The guards were not firing. They were watching her walk toward them, and they were stepping backward, and nobody had ordered the retreat. "She is heading for the vertical access shaft," Preeny reported. "If she reaches it, she has a direct route to the docking level." The docking level, where the transport ship sat, where the exits were. "Lock down the shaft," Thal said. "Seal every pressure door between here and the docking level. Increase corridor gravity to 4 standard units. Drop the temperature in her path to -20. The orders executed. On the feed, the gravity increase hit the human mid-step. Her body compressed. Her knees bent under the sudden quadrupling of her own weight. She staggered. Her hands slammed against the wall, and for a moment she was bent nearly double, her spine curved, her legs shaking with the effort of supporting a body that now weighed 4 times what it should. She did not go down. Her left hand pressed against the wall. Her fingers curled against the smooth metal, and Thal watched the tendons in her forearm stand out as she braced herself. Her breathing changed again, deeper, slower, each breath a deliberate mechanical action, her diaphragm working against a rib cage that weighed 4 times normal. She was adapting. In real time, while he watched, she was recalibrating her body's systems to function under 4 times normal gravity. She took a step, then another. Her pace had slowed by half. She was no longer walking normally. She was grinding forward, each step a controlled fall followed by a controlled recovery. Her body bowed under the weight of a gravity field that would pin most species to the floor. Her bare feet pressed flat with each step, spreading the load, her arches absorbing the impact the way they had been designed to absorb the impact of 100,000-generation march across savannas and mountains and deserts and ice. The temperature was dropping around her. Thal watched the environmental readout, -5, -10, -15. The corridor walls began to frost. Condensation formed on the ceiling panels and froze in place, tiny crystals catching the emergency lighting. The human's breath plumed in white clouds. Her skin visible on her bare arms, her neck, her face responded. The fine hairs rose. The blood vessels near the surface constricted, routing warmth to her core, to her brain, to her vital organs. An autonomic response, not a choice, but it was precisely calibrated, precisely efficient, as if 300,000 years of surviving ice ages and highland winters had engineered a body that treated cold as a familiar inconvenience rather than a crisis. At -18, her pace had slowed to a third of its original speed. She had not stopped. "Warden," Ossel's voice came through from the medical monitoring station. He sounded different now. The professional concern from the intake examination was gone. In its place was something Thal recognized, because he was feeling it himself, the particular weight of a conclusion you do not want to reach. "I am reviewing her biometric feed in real time. Her lactate levels are beyond anything in our database. Her muscle tissue is accumulating damage faster than her repair systems can address it. Her cortisol is in a range we would classify as organ failure territory for any conclave species. She is, by every metric I can measure, in the process of catastrophic physiological failure." And Thal said, "And she is still walking. I do not have a clinical explanation that fits within our existing models. Her body should have shut down 11 minutes ago. It did not shut down because she will not let it shut down. That is not a metaphor, Warden. I mean it precisely. Her prefrontal cortex is actively overriding her autonomic distress signals. She is manually operating her body the way an engineer operates a damaged vessel, rerouting around failures, compensating for losses, prioritizing essential functions. She is dying, and she is using the process of dying as fuel to keep the essential systems running." Thal stared at the feed. The human was still moving, step by deliberate step, through 4 times gravity and sub-zero cold, with broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder, and a body that was failing around her like a ship losing compartments to the void. Her face was a mask of something that was not determination and not anger and not defiance. It was simpler than any of those. It was refusal. A refusal so fundamental that it did not require emotion or conviction or even consciousness. It was biological, structural, woven into the architecture of what she was. She refused to stop. That was the trait, not speed, not strength, not intelligence or cunning or adaptability, though Thal suspected she had all of those in abundance. The trait was that she would not stop, could not stop. Her species had evolved on a world that killed most things, and the ones who survived were the ones who kept moving through the killing, kept breathing through the drowning, kept walking through the breaking. And now that trait was walking through his facility, and his facility did not have a protocol for something that simply did not stop. "Pull Team Kesh back to the vertical shaft entrance," Thal ordered. "Set up a full barricade. Physical barriers, magnetic seals, the emergency blast door. Back up Team Vorath in secondary position. Everything we have." The barricade went up in 3 minutes. The blast door alone was rated to withstand a direct torpedo impact, 2 meters of composite alloy, electromagnetically sealed, with structural integrity monitored by 6 independent sensor arrays. Behind it, 12 guards now, Team Kesh and the backup unit, concussive weapons and stun projectors and physical restraint equipment. Behind them, the shaft access. Behind that, the docking level. Thal watched the human approach. She was slower now. The gravity and cold had cost her more than anything else. Her left hand dragged along the wall, leaving a smear of condensation and a faint pink trace from split skin on her fingertips, the friction of pressing against frosted metal with that much gravity pressing her hand down. Her breathing was audible through the audio feed, ragged, harsh, each inhalation, a sound that made Thal think of metal bending under stress. The head wound had slowed its bleeding. Her body was already clotting it, even now, even with everything else failing. Cell by cell, her blood was sealing the wound while the rest of her systems burned. She reached the blast door. She stopped. For a long moment, she stood in front of it. The frost on her bare arms had crystallized into a thin white layer. Her skin beneath it was flushed red vasodilation. Thal realized, her body cycling blood back to the surface now that the core was secure, dumping heat to keep her muscles from seizing in the cold. Even her thermoregulation was tactical. Even the unconscious processes of her body operated like a combat system, reallocating resources from front to front as the situation demanded. She put her left hand on the blast door, pressed her palm flat against it, stood there for 3 seconds. Then she sat down. Not collapsed, sat. She lowered herself to the deck with a controlled motion that favored her broken left side, put her back against the wall beside the blast door, and sat with her legs extended in front of her. Her breathing began to regulate. The biometric feed showed her heart rate dropping not to normal, but to a sustainable rhythm. Her cortisol levels peaked and began, impossibly, to decline. "She has stopped," Preeny said. There was no relief in her voice. She was too experienced for that. "She has not stopped," Thal said. "She is resting." He understood it now. He had read the file and now he understood it, and the understanding sat in his chest like something cold and heavy. She was not trying to breach the blast door. She was not trying to fight through the barricade. She was doing what her species had always done. She was sitting down, conserving energy, letting her body repair, letting the microhemorrhage in her lungs slow, letting her broken ribs stabilize, letting her torn muscles knit enough fiber to bear weight again, waiting for the moment when his pursuit, with his guards and his weapons and his gravity fields and his cold, would have to pause, would have to rotate shifts, would have to blink. And when it did, she would stand up and she would walk again. He thought about the file, the persistence predators on the human homeworld. The prey that ran faster, leapt higher, fought harder. The prey that did everything right. And the human that followed, walking, always walking, never fast enough to catch but never slow enough to lose, until the prey stopped because it could not continue and the human was still there. He was the prey. His entire facility was the prey. The blast doors and the gravity fields and the armed guards were the sprint, the burst of speed that opened a temporary gap. And the human was the steady pace behind them. And the gap would close, because the gap always closed, because the human did not stop. "Warden," Preeny's voice again, measured, careful. "She has been sitting for 4 minutes. Her biometric feed shows her tissue repair systems are active. Her lactate levels are dropping. Her muscle temperature is stabilizing. She is recovering." Of course she was. Korest's voice came through the squad channel from behind the blast door. "Warden, Team Kesh requesting guidance. Do we maintain position at the barrier?" "Maintain position." "Understood." A pause. "Warden, permission to speak freely." Thal almost said no. He could hear what was coming in the guard's voice, the tone that came before a statement no officer wanted to make. "Speak." "I have been doing this for 12 years. I have held position against Valthek berserkers trying to tear through pressure doors. I have faced down a Kresh acid spitter that dissolved 3 meters of corridor plating while we waited for the containment team. Both of those things were trying to kill me. This human is not trying to kill anyone. She is trying to walk, and I am more afraid of her than I was of either of them." Another pause. "I would like that on the record, sir." Thal noted it. He understood what Korest was doing, the same thing every guard on every facility would eventually do when confronted with something that defied their training. Documenting the fear, putting it in words, not because words helped, but because something in a rational mind needed to label what was happening before it could process it. The fear was not irrational. That was the part that sat wrong in Thal's chest. Fear of a Valthek berserker was simple, it was large, it was enraged, it could tear you apart. You could respect that fear. You could prepare for it. You could overcome it because the berserker would eventually exhaust its rage and the fear would end. Fear of this human was different. It was the fear of something that could not be overcome, not because it was powerful, but because it did not recognize the concept of defeat. You could hurt her and she would stand. You could knock her down and she would rise. You could seal her behind a door rated for warship ordnance, and she would wait and heal and try again. Not because she was brave, not because she was reckless, because she had no other setting. Her body and her mind simply did not contain a state called finished. On the feed, Thal watched the humans breathing. Slow, metered, each exhalation visible as a thin plume of white in the sub-zero air. She was rationing her energy expenditure the way a pilot rationed fuel on a damaged vessel, nothing wasted, nothing spent that did not serve the next action. Even at rest, she was operational. He thought about the other 15 prisoners from the transfer convoy, all high value, all dangerous by conclave standards. Every one of them was locked in their cells on the upper levels, sedated, contained, controlled. He had not thought about them in over an hour. The entire security apparatus of the Vorinthas, designed to manage dozens of the most dangerous inmates in the sector, was currently focused on a single human female who had not raised a hand against anyone. She had consumed every resource he had, not through violence but through the simple, relentless act of putting one foot in front of the other. That was a weapon, Thal realized. Not a weapon she wielded, a weapon she was. Her mere existence, her mere refusal to stop, consumed attention, diverted resources, and eroded morale. Every minute he spent watching her was a minute he was not managing his facility. Every guard positioned at the blast door was a guard not covering another section. Every escalation he ordered, the gas, the gravity, the cold, the concussive charges, was a demonstration to his staff that the standard tools did not work. Each failed measure undermined the next one before it was even deployed. She did not need to escape. She just needed to keep walking, and the facility would dismantle itself around her. Thal opened a direct channel to Rithik Station. The signal took 40 seconds to connect. The face that appeared on his console belonged to Vas Thelen, the warden who had transferred the human to him. Thelen's species had a bony facial structure that made expressions difficult to read, but his eyes, deep-set, dark, carried something that Thal now recognized as the look of someone who had already arrived at the conclusion Thal was only now reaching. "Warden Thelen, you sent me this prisoner." "I did." Thelen's voice was flat, tired. "How long did she take?" 38 minutes to breach the cell. She is currently resting outside my level 1 blast barrier." A pause, resting. "Yes. Then she will begin again." "I know." Thal leaned closer to the console. "Your behavioral log, 47 entries. You watched her escape 11 times. 12, Thelen corrected. The 12th is the transfer itself. She let us put her on the transport. She was cooperative. She walked onto the ship and sat down and let them shackle her and did not resist. I spent the entire transfer window waiting for her to act, and she did nothing. Do you know why?" Thal said nothing. Because she did not need to escape the transport. The transport was already taking her somewhere new. Somewhere that had not learned yet. She was patient enough to let us move her, because every new facility is a new set of walls she has not walked through yet, and eventually she walks through all of them. The channel was silent for a moment. Behind Thelen, Thal could see the operations center of Rithik Station. It looked normal, functional, staffed. But the staff were not looking at their consoles. They were looking at Thelen, watching him talk to the warden who now held the prisoner they had transferred. And in their eyes, Thal saw the same thing he was beginning to see in his own staff's eyes. Not relief that the human was gone, but the quiet, corrosive certainty that wherever she went, she would walk until the walls ran out, and then she would walk to the next set of walls, and the next, and eventually the conclave itself would run out of walls before the human ran out of steps. "One more question," Thal said. In 12 escapes did she ever hurt anyone? No, Thelen's answer was immediate. She never struck a guard, she never used a weapon, she never threatened anyone, she walked. That is all she has ever done. And it is the most frightening thing I have witnessed in 23 years of this work, because you cannot hate her for it. You cannot even be angry at her for it. She is doing the only thing her body knows how to do. She is being what she is. And what she is will walk through everything you build. The channel closed. Thal pulled up the behavioral log from Rithik Station, the one he should have read in full before docking. He read it now, entry by entry, and each one landed like a weight added to a structure that was already bowing. Entry 1. Subject escaped initial holding cell 14 hours after intake. Recaptured in the ventilation system. No resistance during recapture. Entry 7. Subject escaped cell block 3 during a shift rotation. Found 30 minutes later at the outer hull. Had fashioned a signaling device from conduit wiring. Recaptured without force. Entry 12. Subject escaped high-security isolation after sedation was reduced for medical examination. Walked through 2 security checkpoints. Guards reported the subject did not resist recapture, but also did not stop walking until physically restrained by 4 personnel. Continued attempting to walk while being carried back to her cell. Entry 19. Subject breached the reinforced cell in Block 7. Used a stress fracture in the wall composite that maintenance had not identified. Recaptured in the service corridor near the docking ring. Was carrying injuries from a concussive barrier discharge, 3 broken fingers and a fractured orbital bone. Continued walking for 11 minutes after sustaining the injuries. Did not acknowledge pain when questioned by medical staff. Entry 26. Subject escaped during transport between blocks. Was struck by a stun projector at close range. Went down for 8 seconds, stood up. Continued walking, was struck again. Went down for 12 seconds, stood up. Continued walking, was struck a 3rd time. Went down for 19 seconds, stood up. Was restrained by physical tackle from 3 guards. Heart rate during the sequence never exceeded 110. When guards released her in the new cell, she stood and walked to the door and placed her hand on it and waited. Entry 31. Advisory updated. Do not reduce sedation. Do not open the cell for any reason without a minimum of 8 armed personnel present. Do not assume the subject is incapacitated until verified by continuous biometric monitoring for no less than 30 minutes. Note: the subject's body is adapting to the sedative compound. Effective suppression duration has decreased from 11 hours to 4 hours over the past 6 weeks. Entry 39. Second advisory. Subject has now escaped containment 11 times in 4 months. Recommend transfer to a facility with higher structural security rating. Note: the subject has never harmed a guard. She has never attacked anyone. She has never used a weapon. She walks. That is the full extent of her behavior. She walks and she does not stop. Entry 47. The final entry. Written by Thelen himself. It was not formatted like the others. It read: I am transferring this prisoner because I cannot hold her, not because my facility lacks the physical capability. It does not. We have held far more dangerous inmates. I am transferring her because of what happens to my staff. They watch her. They watch her escape, and they watch her walk, and they watch her get hit and go down and stand back up and walk again, and something changes in them. It is not that they fear her. It is that they begin to believe she cannot be stopped. And once a guard believes that about a prisoner, the guard becomes useless. She does not need to fight us. She does not need to outsmart us. She just needs to keep walking, and eventually, we stop believing that our walls mean anything. I have been a warden for 23 years. I have held murderers and war criminals and things that ate their cell mates. None of them frightened my staff the way this woman does by simply walking down a corridor. Transfer her. Transfer her somewhere that has not seen what she does, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Thal lowered the file. He read it again. He read the words "she walks" and understood that the phrase was not a description of an action. It was a description of an identity. A Valthek berserker raged, a Kresh dissolved, a Threnix charged, a human walked. It was what the species did. It was what the species was. And the verb was terrifying not because of its violence, there was no violence in it, but because of its duration. Walking was not an event. It was a condition, a permanent state, an answer to every question the universe asked, and the answer was always the same: I am still here. He thought about the capture report. 9 pages long, 3 times standard length, because the team that captured Marin Sorrel had needed that many pages to explain why a single civilian mining colony worker had required a full tactical unit to bring in. The report described a woman who had run, not walked, run for 11 hours through the debris of her destroyed settlement after the Conclave's pacification forces had landed. She had run through collapsing structures. She had run through chemical deterrent clouds. She had run with a fragment of shrapnel embedded in her left calf that should have severed her mobility. The tactical team had deployed 3 pursuit vehicles, 2 aerial drones, and 22 personnel. They had cornered her 6 times. 6 times she had found a route out, a gap, a direction nobody was covering. Not because she was tactically brilliant, because she would not stop moving. The pursuit vehicles needed to refuel. The drones needed to recharge. The personnel needed to rotate. She did not need any of those things. She needed only to keep going, and she kept going, and eventually the pursuit ran out of energy before she did. They caught her on hour 12, not because she slowed down, because the settlement ran out. She reached the edge of the colony's perimeter wall, and beyond it was open terrain with no cover, and even then she had hesitated for only a moment before the tackle brought her down. 3 soldiers. She did not fight them. She tried to walk. Pinned on the ground by 3 armored soldiers, she tried to walk. Her legs moved against the earth, her feet pushing, driving, attempting to gain traction against the dirt, not struggling, walking. The motion was automatic, reflexive, as natural and as unstoppable as a heartbeat. The capture team leader had appended a personal note to the report. I have never seen anything like this. She was not resisting arrest. She was not fighting us. She was simply continuing. I do not believe she knew how to stop. 4 months later, 11 escapes later, the Conclave still did not know how to stop her either. Thal lowered the file. On the feed, Marin Sorrel was still sitting against the wall. Her breathing had normalized. Her eyes were closed. She looked, to anyone who did not know better, like a tired woman resting after a long shift. But the biometric feed told the truth. Her body was rebuilding. Cell by cell, fiber by fiber, the damage was being addressed. Not healed, not fully, not yet, but stabilized, managed, made functional enough to continue. Her liver was processing the last traces of the sedative. Her clotting factors were sealing the microhemorrhage in her lung, and the broken ribs were being braced by swelling tissue that her body was deploying like internal scaffolding. Not a repair, a workaround enough to bear weight, enough to walk. Thal looked at the blast door on the feed, rated for torpedo impact. He looked at the 12 guards behind it, armed and armored and trained and afraid. He looked at the gravity field set to 4 times standard. He looked at the temperature at -20. He looked at all of it, every tool, every weapon, every barrier, every protocol his facility possessed. And for the first time in 31 years of service, Warden Kesoth Thal felt something he did not have a professional framework for. It was not panic. It was not the sharp, immediate fear of a direct threat. It was slower than that, deeper. It was the understanding that everything he had, every wall, every weapon, every system, was a sprint. And the thing on the other side of his blast door was a marathon. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually she would be standing on the other side of every barrier he erected, because she would not stop erecting herself against them. Because her body would keep healing and her mind would keep overriding and her legs would keep moving, and the only way to stop it was to kill her, and killing a prisoner was not containment. Killing was an admission that containment had failed. He opened a channel to Conclave High Command. "This is Warden Thal aboard the Vorenthas. I am requesting an emergency advisory on the containment of Terran inmate 3308. Current protocols are insufficient. Standard restraint, chemical sedation, stun weapons, concussive munitions, somnolent gas, physical barriers, gravity manipulation, and temperature reduction have all failed to achieve sustained containment. The subject has escaped every facility that has held her, and she will escape this one." He paused, looked at the feed. The human's eyes were still closed, her breathing was slow, steady, patient. She does not fight, she does not attack, she does not plan elaborate escapes or exploit complex security vulnerabilities. She simply walks. She receives damage and she keeps walking. She is restrained and she finds a way to walk. She is sedated and she walks through the sedation. She is struck down and she stands up and she walks. She is gassed and she finds a pocket of air, and she breathes and she waits and she walks. Another pause. The words he needed were difficult, not because they were complex, but because they required him to say something that a warden of 31 years should never have to say about a single unarmed inmate. "I am requesting the advisory because I do not believe this prisoner can be contained by physical means, not because we lack sufficient force. We have sufficient force to kill her. We do not have sufficient force to make her stop. I have reviewed the complete behavioral record, and I have observed her directly, and I have consulted the xenobiological literature, and I am telling you that the problem is not structural. It is biological. Her species does not stop. It is not a choice she is making. It is what she is. It is what her species was built to be. They are the thing that keeps coming after everything else quits." He watched the feed for a long time after he closed the channel. The human sat. The guards waited. The blast door stood between them, torpedo-rated, reinforced, sealed. Thal thought about the predator and the prey on the human homeworld. The prey that was faster. The prey that was stronger. The prey that did everything right and still died, not because it was caught but because it stopped, and the thing behind it did not. He thought about his blast door. Then he began writing his transfer request. Preeni appeared at his side. She had been quiet for several minutes, watching the same feed, reading the same biometric data. Her neck frills had not relaxed. They would not relax, Thal suspected, for a very long time. "Where will you transfer her?" Preeni asked. Thal did not answer immediately. He looked at the behavioral log. 11 escapes at Rithik. 1 escape here, 38 minutes after arrival. 12 facilities, 12 sets of walls, 12 groups of guards who had watched a human walk through everything they had. And at the end of each entry, the same implicit admission: we could not hold her because she would not stay held. "That is not the question," Thal said. Preeni waited. "The question is whether there is anywhere in the conclave that can hold something that does not stop." He turned from the console. "I have been doing this work for 31 years. I have held species that could tear through bulkheads with their bare hands. I have held species that could dissolve the walls with their secretions. I have held species that could interface with the facility's electronics and turn our own systems against us. Every one of them could be contained, because every one of them had a threshold, a point where the barriers exceeded their capability and they stopped trying." He looked at the feed one final time. Marin Sorrel, sitting against the wall, eyes closed, breathing slow, healing. "Waiting." "She does not have a threshold," Thal said. "That is the problem. That is the only problem. And I do not know how to solve it because I do not believe it can be solved." He filed the transfer request. Destination unspecified. Recommendation: consult Conclave Xenobiology Division for species-specific containment protocol development. Priority: immediate. Attached note, 1 line: the human is resting. She will begin again soon. On the feed, as Thal filed the request, Marin Sorrel opened her eyes. She did not look at the camera this time. She looked at the blast door, studied it. The way she had studied the docking bay when she arrived, that slow, measuring attention, cataloging, filing, preparing. Her left hand pressed flat against the deck. She shifted her weight. Preeny saw it on the feed. Her neck frills pressed flat. "Warden, she is moving." Thal did not respond. He was already watching. The human braced herself against the wall. Her broken ribs protested the biometric feed, registered the pain spike, registered her cortex overriding it, registered her heart rate climbing from resting to operational. She planted one foot, then the other. She stood in the corridor under 4 times gravity and sub-zero temperatures, with 3 broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder and a body that had been beaten and gassed and frozen, and sedated beyond any reasonable threshold of function. Marin Sorrel put her hand on the blast door. She stood there, feeling the metal, reading the seams. And Warden Kesoth Thal, watching from the operations center with 31 years of experience and every weapon his facility possessed, understood what he was looking at. He was not looking at a prisoner. He was not looking at a threat. He was looking at something far simpler and far worse. He was looking at patience, the kind that did not need to be faster or stronger or smarter, the kind that only needed to be still there when everything else was not. She would find the seam, or she would wait for the shift change, or she would outlast the gravity generators, or she would simply stand at the door until someone opened it, because someone always opened the door eventually, for maintenance, for inspection, for a shift rotation that required passage. And when they did, she would walk through. Because that was what humans did. Not the fastest, not the strongest, not the most cunning, just the last one still moving when the race was over, the last one still breathing when the air ran out, the last one still standing when everything reasonable, everything logical, everything that understood the mathematics of damage and exhaustion and pain had long since sat down. The thing that kept walking after everything else stopped. Thal sat at his console and watched the human's hand move across the blast door, reading its surface the way her ancestors had read the earth for tracks, and he understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has run out of options, what it meant to be the prey. She would walk again and again and again. And there was no wall in the galaxy built for something that never quit. The response from Conclave High Command arrived 43 minutes later. Thal read it twice. Then he read it a third time, because the first 2 readings had failed to produce any emotional response, and he wanted to confirm that the numbness was genuine and not a malfunction in his own cognition. The advisory was 6 words long: maintain containment, further guidance forthcoming. 6 words. He had sent them a detailed report on a prisoner who had walked through every countermeasure his facility possessed, and they had responded with 6 words that meant nothing. Maintain containment. As if he had not just explained, in explicit operational language, that containment was a term that did not apply to this prisoner. As if the problem were a matter of effort rather than category. He closed the advisory and turned back to the feed. Marin Sorrel was still at the blast door. She had not moved from her position, but she had changed what she was doing. Her left hand was no longer pressed flat against the surface. It was moving, slowly, methodically, tracing the seam where the door met the frame. Her fingers followed the junction line with the precision of a surveyor mapping terrain, pressing, testing, reading the metal the way a mechanic reads an engine. By sound, by vibration, by the subtle language of material under stress. Thal enlarged the camera view. He could see her fingertips now, raw and split from the frosted corridor walls, leaving faint smears of blood along the seam. She did not appear to notice the damage. Her attention was entirely focused on the door, and the quality of that focus was what made something cold settle behind Thal's sternum. It was not the frantic, searching attention of someone looking for an escape. It was the methodical attention of someone conducting an assessment, cataloging data, building a model, the same kind of attention she had shown in the docking bay, except now it was directed at the single barrier between her and the next corridor, and Thal understood that she was not trying to find a weakness. She was learning the door. Preeni, what is the maintenance schedule for the level 1 blast door? Preeni checked her console. Next scheduled inspection is in 46 hours. Standard integrity check and seal verification. 46 hours. That was how long someone would have to open the door. 46 hours for a body that was already rebuilding itself, already metabolizing every chemical they had put into it, already adapting to the gravity and the cold. Thal did not believe he had 46 hours. He did not believe the blast door had 46 hours. Not because the human could breach it by force, she could not, and they both knew it, but because the blast door was a system, and every system had a maintenance cycle, and she was patient enough to wait for the cycle, and smart enough to exploit it when it came. Cancel the inspection, Thal said. Reschedule for remote diagnostic only. No physical access to corridor Oryx 7 until the prisoner is transferred. Understood. Preeni entered the change, then she paused. Warden. If we cancel the inspection, the door's environmental seals will not be verified. The cold protocol is creating thermal stress on the frame seals. Without verification, the integrity rating drops from. I am aware of the rating. Thal's voice was flat. If I send a maintenance crew to that door, she will be watching them. She will see every tool they carry, every panel they open, every code they enter. She learned the electromagnetic architecture of a gravity lock in under 40 minutes. How long do you think she needs to learn a blast door? Preeni did not answer. She did not need to. The silence was answer enough. On the feed, the human had finished her survey of the door seam. She stepped back one step, under the crushing weight of quadruple gravity, and looked at the door with an expression that Thal could only describe as satisfied. Not pleased, not triumphant, satisfied. The way a craftsman looks at a problem once the solution has become apparent. She had learned what she needed to learn. Then she did something that Thal had not expected, and it was the unexpectedness that drove the final spike of cold, understanding through the center of his professional composure. She sat down again. Not to rest. The biometric feed told him that much her vitals were not returning to a resting state. Her heart rate held steady at 94. Her cortisol remained elevated. Her adrenal system was primed. She was not resting. She was choosing not to act. She had found something, some flaw, some angle, some piece of information, and she was choosing to wait. Not because she was unable to proceed, but because the timing was not right. Because patience was a tool, and she wielded it the way her species had always wielded it, as a weapon more effective than speed or strength or fury. Thal opened the squad channel to Korest. What is your team's endurance status? A pause. We have been holding position for 2 hours and 14 minutes. The cold protocol is affecting the team. Suit heaters are compensating, but core fatigue is setting in. Standard rotation protocol would have us cycle out in 46 minutes. 46 minutes. There it was again. A number the human did not need to know precisely, she only needed to feel it. The subtle shift in the guard's posture as fatigue accumulated. The fractional slowing of their response times. The growing weight of standing in formation with weapons raised against a target that was not attacking, not threatening, not doing anything except sitting on the floor and waiting. She was running them down, the same way her ancestors had run down prey on the plains of Earth, not by chasing but by persisting. The guards had burst energy, the focused readiness of a trained tactical response, but burst energy had a shelf life, and the human was the thing that outlasted shelf lives. Rotate the teams, Thal ordered. Fresh squad every 90 minutes. I want no team holding position for longer than that. Warden, we only have 4 tactical squads available. A 90-minute rotation will exhaust our reserve within. I know the mathematics. Execute the rotation. The mathematics were simple, and they were terrible. 4 squads, 90-minute rotations. That gave him 6 hours before the cycle repeated and fatigued teams were returning to a position they had already found demoralizing. 6 hours before the guards who had watched Maren Sorrel survive everything they threw at her were standing in front of her again, knowing, not suspecting, knowing that their weapons did not work and their barriers were temporary. And the human needed only one moment, one rotation gap, one instant of reduced attention during the handoff between squads. She did not need to overpower anyone. She needed to walk through a gap that existed for 3 seconds, and her entire body was designed to be ready for precisely that kind of moment. Thal looked at his console. The transfer request was still pending. Destination unspecified because there was no destination. Every facility in the Conclave's detention network operated on the same principles: walls, locks, sedation, guards. The Vorenthas was the strongest of them. If she walked through the Vorenthas, there was nowhere else to send her that she would not also walk through. The realization landed like a verdict. He opened the xenobiological file again, scrolled past the sections he had already read: the persistence predation, the thermoregulation, the pain modulation. He was looking for something else. Something the file might contain that his previous reading had skipped, because he had not known to look for it. He found it in a subsection titled Psychological Endurance Profile. It was short, clinical, and it demolished his last professional illusion. Terran psychological resilience, the file stated, was not a separate trait from their physical endurance. It was the same trait, expressed at a different level. Their prefrontal cortex, the brain structure responsible for planning, decision-making, and the override of autonomic responses, was disproportionately large relative to their body mass. It was also unusually well connected to their limbic system, the brain's emotional center. This connectivity allowed Terrans to do something that the file described as narrative override, the ability to construct a mental framework around suffering that transformed it from an obstacle into fuel. A Terran in pain could tell themselves a story about the pain, could reframe it as progress, as evidence that they were still alive, as proof that the enemy's best efforts were not enough. The story did not eliminate the pain. It changed the pain's meaning, and a Terran operating under a narrative framework could sustain effort levels that exceeded their physiological baseline by margins the file described as difficult to reconcile with known biological limits. The file cited examples: a Terran who had amputated his own arm to free himself from a collapsed structure, then walked 11 kilometers to reach help. A Terran who had swum for 36 hours in open ocean after a vessel sank, in water temperatures that should have induced hypothermia within 4 hours. A Terran who had survived on a barren rock with no food for 76 standard days, systematically rationing body fat and muscle mass, while maintaining cognitive function sufficient to construct a signaling device from debris. Each example followed the same pattern. The body failed. The mind refused to acknowledge the failure, and the body, operating under the mind's authority, continued to function past every predicted termination point. The file's conclusion was a single paragraph that Thal read 3 times. Terran endurance cannot be addressed through physical countermeasures alone. The species' psychological resilience functions as a force multiplier on their physiological capabilities, extending operational duration beyond any model that accounts only for biological factors. Standard containment assumes a subject whose resistance is bounded by physical limits. Terran subjects treat physical limits as negotiable parameters, and their brains possess the architecture to enforce that treatment at a neurological level. Containment strategies that do not account for psychological endurance will fail against Terran subjects with sufficient motivation. Sufficient motivation. Thal looked at the feed, Maren Sorrel. Civilian mining colony worker, captured during the pacification of a colonial outpost. Everything she had been: her home, her work, Her community had been taken from her by the Conclave's military forces, and then they had put her in a cell and she had walked out, 11 times, 12. Her motivation was not complicated. It was not strategic or political or ideological. It was the simplest motivation any sapient being could possess. She wanted to go home, or failing that, she wanted to not be in a cage. And that motivation, filtered through a brain that could rewrite the meaning of pain and a body that did not recognize the concept of defeat, produced something that the Conclave's entire detention apparatus could not overcome. Because motivation was fuel, and her fuel supply was the most renewable resource in the known galaxy, the desire to be free. Thal closed the file. He sat at his console in the operations center of the most secure detention barge in the Conclave fleet, surrounded by officers and monitors and weapons systems and protocols that represented the accumulated security doctrine of a galactic civilization, and he felt the weight of an understanding that none of it had prepared him for. They were not equipped for this, not the Vorenthas, not the Conclave, not any system built on the assumption that sufficient force could end resistance, because force could end resistance. Force could break bones and rupture organs and shut down nervous systems. Force could make a body stop. But it could not make a human stop, because a human was not a body. A human was a body operated by a mind that would not accept the body's termination, and the mind would keep sending the signals and the body would keep obeying them, and the process would continue until the body was dead, not defeated, not contained, dead. There was no intermediate state. There was functional or there was dead, and as long as Marin Sorrel was functional, she would walk. A proximity alert chimed on Preeny's console. "Warden, the rotation is approaching. Team Voreth is moving into position. Team Kesh is preparing to disengage." Thal watched the feed. The human's eyes were open now. She was looking at the pressure door behind which the guards were positioned, not at the blast door in front of her. At the pressure door, the one the guards would have to open to execute their rotation. She knew, she could hear them moving, or she could feel the vibration through the deck, or she had simply counted the time and calculated the interval. However she knew, and she was watching. "Hold the rotation," Thal said. "Warden." "Hold it, keep Team Kesh in position. Do not open the pressure door." Preeny relayed the order. On the squad channel, Korest's acknowledgement was immediate but strained. His team had been standing in sub-zero temperatures for over 2 hours now. The suit heaters were designed for 60-minute cold exposure. Thal was asking them to double that. He was asking them to do it, because the alternative was opening a door in the human's line of sight. And if they opened that door, she would learn its mechanism. She would see the guards move through it, see the formation break and reform, see the gap. And the next time the door opened, the time after that, or the time after that, she would be ready. This was what it meant to face a persistence predator. Every action you took to protect yourself became a data point the predator could use. Every defensive measure revealed information about your systems. Every rotation, every shift change, every maintenance cycle was a window. And the predator did not need all the windows. It needed one. The minutes passed. On the feed, Marin Sorrel continued to watch the pressure door, patient, steady, her breathing visible as white plumes in the frozen air. After 7 minutes, she turned her gaze back to the blast door and placed her hand on it again. Not pushing, feeling, reading the vibrations that traveled through the structure from the other side, the hum of generators, the movement of personnel, the subtle electromagnetic signature of the lock mechanism cycling through its idle state. Thal thought about Thelen's words. Every new facility is a new set of walls she has not walked through yet, and eventually she walks through all of them. He thought about the 12 escapes documented in the behavioral log, each one different, each one exploiting a different weakness, a different seam, a different moment of institutional inattention. She never used the same method twice because she did not need to. She learned each facility's individual architecture, found its individual vulnerabilities, and applied her individual, relentless pressure to the single point most likely to yield. Not with genius, with patience. Patience and time, the two resources no prison could outlast, because prisons were built by organizations, and organizations had budgets and schedules and personnel rotations and maintenance cycles and bureaucratic friction, and all the thousand small vulnerabilities that came with being a system operated by many beings rather than a single, unified will. Marin Sorrel was a single, unified will. She had no budget constraints. She had no shift changes. She had no maintenance schedule. She had only the goal and the body and the mind, and the three of them worked in perfect, terrifying coordination toward a single outcome. Korest's voice came through the channel again, tighter now. The cold was reaching him. Warden, requesting permission to at least rotate individual squad members. Trevin's suit heater has failed. His core temperature is dropping. Thal closed his eyes. The irony was not lost on him. His guards, armored, armed, operating in purpose-built tactical equipment, were failing from cold exposure while the human sat on the bare deck in a prisoner's thin garment and bare feet, surviving on nothing but her biology's obscene refusal to surrender to environmental conditions that should have killed her an hour ago. Pull Trevin out through the secondary access on the level above. Route him through corridor Auric 9. Do not open any door that the prisoner can see. The workaround took 6 minutes. 6 minutes to extract one guard through a route that the human could not observe. This was his reality now. Every personnel movement had to account for a single prisoner's line of sight. Every logistical decision had to be filtered through the question, what will she learn from this? He was running his facility around her. She had become the center of gravity and everything else orbited her, and she was doing nothing, sitting on the floor, breathing, healing, waiting. Thal opened a secondary channel to the Conclave's Xenobiological Division. This time, he did not file a formal request. He contacted Dr. Cesra Vone directly, the division's senior researcher on Terran biology, whose name appeared on the primary authorship line of the file Thal had been reading. The connection took 30 seconds. Vone appeared on the console, a thin, precise individual with the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades studying things that frightened her and had learned to contain the fear inside academic rigor. Warden Thal, I expected this call. You expected it. I was notified when the transfer advisory was filed from Rithik. I have been monitoring your facility's alert feeds remotely since the containment failure. She paused. Your sedation reports are remarkable. She metabolized Category 5 at double concentration in under 40 minutes. That exceeds our fastest predicted clearance rate by a factor of 3. I did not call to discuss her metabolism, Doctor. I called to ask you a direct question. Ask it. Can she be contained? Vone's answer was not immediate. She looked at something off-screen. Thal suspected it was the biometric feed she had been monitoring, the same feed that showed Marin Sorrel's body rebuilding itself on the floor of his corridor. When she looked back, her expression carried the same flat, exhausted quality that Thal had heard in Thelen's voice. Physically, yes. In the sense that you can build a box strong enough that she cannot break it with her body, yes. Your blast door is an adequate example. She cannot breach it through force. In the narrow mechanical sense, containment is achievable. But containment is not a mechanical problem. Containment is a systemic problem. The box must be opened, maintained, supplied, inspected. The box exists within a system of other boxes and corridors and doors and schedules, and the system has seams, and she finds seams the way water finds cracks. Given enough time, she will find every seam in every system you construct. Not because she is brilliant, although her adaptive intelligence is considerably above your standard briefing's estimate. Because she is relentless. Because her brain catalogs every piece of information it receives and never discards anything, and eventually the accumulated data produces a route. She does not need a plan. She needs enough observations, and time, and the willingness to try every observation until one of them works. Then what do you recommend? Vaughn was quiet for a moment. I recommend that the conclave consider the possibility that this prisoner cannot be held involuntarily on a long-term basis, not without dedicating a facility exclusively to her containment, a facility designed from the ground up around the single purpose of holding one human, with no maintenance cycles she can observe, no personnel rotations she can exploit, no systemic seams she can find. The cost of such a facility would be extraordinary. The operational complexity would be unprecedented. And even then, I am not confident it would work, because we would be building the facility with our understanding of her capabilities as they exist now. And her capabilities are not static. She adapts. She learns. She improves. The facility you build today will be inadequate for the prisoner she becomes in 6 months. The channel closed. Thal sat with the assessment for a long time. On the feed, Marin Sorrell stood up. The motion was slow under the quadruple gravity, but it was steady. She braced against the wall, pushed herself upright, and stood facing the blast door. Her breathing was controlled. Her eyes were clear. The head wound had fully clotted. Her dislocated shoulder still hung wrong, but the rest of her body had reorganized around the injury, redistributing the work to her functional arm and her core, compensating with the same ruthless biological efficiency that characterized everything about her species. She placed her hand on the blast door one more time, then she turned away from it. Preeny straightened at her console. She is moving, away from the blast door. She is heading back down the corridor. Back, not forward. Away from the barrier and back toward the deeper levels of the detention block. Thal watched, and the cold understanding that had been building in his chest crystallized into something sharp and final. She was not retreating. She was not giving up. She had assessed the blast door, cataloged its properties, determined that a direct approach at this moment was suboptimal, and now she was going back into the corridors she had already walked, back to find a different route. Because there was always a different route, and she had all the time in the galaxy to find it. Track her, Thal said. His voice was very quiet. Track her and do not lose her. Reassign all available camera feeds to follow her movement. I want a continuous biometric monitor. I want to know where she goes, what she touches, what she looks at. For how long, Warden? Thal looked at his console. The transfer request pending. The advisory from High Command, 6 words of nothing. The xenobiological assessment, recommending a facility that did not exist to contain a prisoner who would outgrow it. For as long as she walks, he said. On the feed, Marin Sorrell moved through the corridor of sub-level 9, bare feet on frosted metal, blood dried on her face, broken ribs braced by the scaffolding of her own swelling tissue, walking at a pace that was not fast and was not slow and would not change and would not stop. Her eyes moved as she walked left, right, up, down, counting vents, measuring distances, noting the rhythm of the lighting panels, the spacing of the sensor arrays, the gauge of the conduit bundles running along the ceiling. Learning. Behind her, the blast door stood intact. 2 meters of composite alloy, sealed, reinforced, monitored. A barrier sufficient to stop a torpedo. She did not need to stop a torpedo. She needed to stop being in a cage. And against that need, deployed with the full weight of a body that would not break and a mind that would not bend, 2 meters of composite alloy was a temporary inconvenience. The galaxy had faster species, stronger species, species with natural weapons that could shred armor plating, species with intellects that could calculate orbital mechanics in real time, species with senses so acute they could detect a heartbeat through a hull. Each of them, by some measure, was superior to the small, soft, blunt-toothed, clawless creature walking barefoot through a frozen corridor on the lowest deck of a prison barge. But every one of those species had a limit. a point at which the body's damage exceeded the mind's ability to compensate, a threshold at which the pain became louder than the purpose, a moment when the organism acknowledged defeat, not as a choice, but as a biological inevitability, as natural and as final as entropy. Maren Sorrel did not have that moment. Her species had traded every biological advantage for the one advantage that mattered more than all the others combined. They did not quit, not by choice, not by training, by architecture. By 300,000 years of evolution on a planet that had tried to kill them with ice and fire and drought and flood and predators and disease and famine and each other. And they had survived all of it, not because they were the best at anything, but because they were the last ones still trying after everything else had given up. Thal understood now what Thelen had meant, what Vone had meant, what the capture team leader had meant when he wrote, "I do not believe she knew how to stop." It was not that she chose to continue. It was that continuing was her default state. Stopping required a decision. Walking did not. Walking was what happened when no decision was made. It was the baseline, the resting condition. The thing her body did when nothing commanded it otherwise. The way a heart beat and lungs breathed and eyes blinked. She walked the way stars burned, not because they chose to, because that was what they were. And you did not build a wall to contain a star. You endured the light, or you moved out of its path. Thal watched her disappear around the corner of the corridor, heading deeper into the labyrinth of Sublevel 9, and he knew with the absolute certainty of a man who had finally understood the shape of the problem that she would find a way. Not today, perhaps, not through the blast door, through something else. A maintenance hatch left unsealed for 3 seconds during a repair. A ventilation conduit whose dimensions had been miscalculated by a fraction of a centimeter. A guard who hesitated for one heartbeat too long during a shift change. Something, somewhere. There would be a seam and she would find it and she would walk through it. And then the next facility would file a transfer request. And the next one. And the next one. And eventually the conclave would run out of facilities and the human would still be walking. Preeny stood at his side, watching the same feed. Her neck frills had not moved from their flattened position in over 2 hours. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that the feed did not say for itself. The human walked, the camera followed. And Warden Kessoth Thal, 31 years in the service of the most powerful interstellar authority in the known galaxy, sat in his operations center and waited for the inevitable, not because he had given up, but because giving up was a luxury reserved for species that recognized the concept. The human did not, and against that single terrifying fact, the conclave had no protocol, no doctrine, and no wall that would hold. She would walk again. She was walking now, and she would keep walking until every door was behind her and the stars were ahead, because that was what her species did, and nothing in the galaxy had ever found a way to make them stop.